Today on the Self Smarter podcast.
If you want someone to hear you in the most effective way, then you have to think about your delivery and you have to think about your audience and what your tendencies may be when they're in an optimum state and when you're totally missing the mark.
Hi, we're Danelle and Megan, the hosts of this conversation-centric podcast for leaders seeking to be better every day. Whether you choose to be a leader in the workplace, at home, or in your community, we believe the most effective leaders are equipped to not only be self-starters, but self-smarter.
Hello, and welcome to Self Smarter. I'm Megan, and this is my friend and co-host, Danelle.
Hello.
Okay, I just want to brace for a minute and just slow things down. Can you believe Christmas is a week away? Like, we're at that point where we realize that, and Hanukkah started last night. Like, what the heck?
Oh my gosh, no.
I know.
January was yesterday.
Yesterday, 2022. What happened to you? Where'd you go, 2022? You came in and you slipped into our lives. And we needed you so badly.
It was, and if you listen to this podcast, you know for certain, I mean, there were moments where it felt like every day was a year, for me at least. And then there were times where it was like a week was a minute. I don't know. It was an interesting year of flying by and going really slow. I guess it all depends on what you're dealing with.
Right. It's the truth. And my mom used to say, especially when I was a teenager, you need to embrace your youth because when you get older, the years go by faster and faster every year. And now I see it. I feel that. All right. Here's what I'm curious about.
Okay.
You actually have a lot of activity going on in New York around this time of year during the holidays. There was the Thanksgiving Day parade, and then soon there'll be the New Year's Eve festivities in Times Square, plus everything else. You'll have a lot of traffic. A lot of people are there.
Yeah, it's interesting. And just for reference, it's not mine. You're talking about what's going on in this city.
Correct.
Right? Like, obviously, the parade and the
macro.
New Year's Eve celebrate. Yeah, it's interesting because you see that stuff, at least for those of us who don't live in New York, and you watch the parade or you've watched one of the New Year's specials or any of the other things, the lighting of the tree. Like, there's so many iconic things that people across the U.S. and the world, quite frankly, are exposed to relative to this city. And then being here has given me, it's just a different perspective. It's like, I knew generally where the parade route was, but then now my apartment or the one that I'm moving to is literally 2 avenues away from, and I mean, I walk down that street. I know that street. I recognize not just Macy's, but I recognize other things on the parade route. And it's such an interesting thing. And to know, I know more about the area where the iconic ball is going to drop. And I mean, obviously that's Times Square, and I know Times Square, but it's just, I know more about the city now, and I'm seeing these things through such a different lens. It's just very interesting to be here and to know more about how things work relative to those iconic events. And it's very interesting. I'm just finding it to be very fun to learn about.
I bet that those are, like you said, iconic.
I've never wanted to go to that parade, but now I do, because now I know so much more about it and how it works. And I find it to be fascinating.
And that tree takes a long journey, and
it has a whole story, and there's I've never thought of it that way. I've always I don't know, just beautiful tree to take a picture in front of. And we've done it. You and I've actually done that together. We've done it as families. So but it feels different being here and experiencing these things. So with the locals.
Well, one little thing that just creeps up every so often when I see all these people gathering in the city, and I know that they're there for a long time, like potentially standing there and waiting for hours. You know what I'm going to say. You know what I'm about to say.
For the parade?
Yeah, the parade, Times Square. Like there are myths or legends, or maybe they're truths about how people are able to do that. And I worry about the diapers. Are there...
What diapers?
We got to crack this code. Like okay, evidently the rumor is, that people have to wear the diapers because they have to be there at like 5 a.m. or 4 a.m. to get their seat or to get their place in line. And then there's
no place to go.
No place to go. You can get out of line. And so you're wearing like an adult sized, I didn't know that like the big a diaper, like I imagine a baby diaper on a person and it just makes me laugh.
Oh,
like a Huggies.
I don't want to be able to concentrate for the rest of this episode. People wear, okay, well, let me tell you something right now.
Can you just debunk that or validate that over the next couple of weeks? While there's a lot of people in New York, can you just get the skinny on that?
I'm just going to start interviewing people. So have you been to the parade or have you been to New Year's? And if they say yes, I'm going to say, I need to know. Can you fill out this short survey?
Yes. Or you could just say Pampers or Huggies and see if they go, if they know.
Do those brands make adult diapers?
I have no idea.
Well, first of all, I can't imagine that a bunch of people are standing around in adult diapers for these events.
You know what?
No,
I'm
ma'am.
sorry, listeners.
No, ma'am.
I'm sorry, listeners. It's just something to think about as you're celebrating all these things that we're watching, iconic events happening in New York. Diapers. That's all I'm going to say.
All right, I'll start asking, but I'm afraid of the answers.
I am too.
Okay.
Especially based on who you ask on the street. So just
thanks for throwing in that zinger.
Before we hop into our topic, let's jump to this quickie commercial. Self-smarter listeners, sometimes I wonder if we're being self-smarter about our businesses. When I see or hear of a business working without a marketing plan, I have literal tears well up in my eyes. Why? Because our clients have a plan in place that puts them in a position to win when they're seeking to engage with their target audiences. Do you have a marketing plan for 2023? If not, you need to call me Stat so we can get your marketing plan in the works. Don't have a lot of money? Well, that's perfect because marketing plans are on the lower end of our project pricing and have the most amazing outcome. Get yours moving now. You know what I just realized, Danelle, that I didn't even say? Is this is our last episode of 2022.
Whoa. Wow. Well, okay. Well, that helps me recover from diaper talk. So yeah, I can't believe it. This is our last one. So if you've been there since the beginning, just again, we're so appreciative. Like, thank you. And if you're new, I hope you go back and listen to some of the episodes and we just continue to garner a following of people that really care about being self-smarter. And we're still learning so much along the way. So yeah, I can't believe it. I cannot believe it's our last episode.
I can't either. And it's kind of interesting that today we're talking about improving communication because I just threw out the word diapers. So that probably wasn't the smartest move. And then secondly, I forgot to mention that this is our last episode of 2022. So 2.
Well, you didn't forget. You recovered.
I did. We did. Yes. So on that note, as we kick off, let's talk about improving communication and by Enneagram type, which to me makes so much sense because we're all so different. And I know you're going to talk a little bit more about that. So I'd love for you to do that. Talk to us about improving our communication by Enneagram type.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We were brainstorming this topic, improving communications, and we were looking and deciding on how we were going to structure this particular episode for our listeners. And everything that we looked at, it was like, the best way to do this is by Enneagram type. So if you're listening to this episode and you don't know your Enneagram, you might want to go back to, I think we have 4 or 5 episodes specifically on the Enneagram, and definitely go back to one of the earliest ones where we talk about what is the Enneagram. I think it would be very helpful for you, and certainly encourage you to take the assessment, which can be found at the Enneagram Institute. That's the one we recommend. It's $12, the best $12 you'll probably spend. It's a wonderful way to start off the year, by the way, by doing that and learning. And so when we're talking about communications, it's just a good reference point because it shows you, and for those of you who don't know, the 9 different types and how we effectively communicate, and quite frankly, when we're not being effective in our communication. So we decided to structure this particular episode knowing that our Enneagram episodes are extremely popular with our listeners. And we continue to get recommendations for us to do more content relative to Enneagram. So we decided to structure it this way. But the reason why is because we all have different personalities and we have different reasons why and how we communicate and why we don't.
Mm-hmm.
And when you understand that about someone, or definitely most importantly about yourself, you're going to become more effective if you adopt that understanding and practice it. And I think too, the triggers and the worries are unique across different personalities. So if you're thinking about Enneagram types, there's certain things that are going to affect other numbers and not others. And when we know that, we can go, oh, well, that's why I'm struggling to communicate with this person, is because we are seeing things completely in a different light.
Right.
And so, when you put it all together without awarenesses of differences, it causes an unnecessary mess.
Right.
And that we don't need.
That's right.
And when I say mess, a conflict, an argument, a complete just misunderstanding, and quite frankly, judgment. And that's where, when we are attempting to effectively communicate, we must proceed with some understanding. And that's why we decided to structure this particular episode and this topic using our Enneagram numbers.
I mean, why do we think that is? I mean, are there tendencies people have?
Yeah, I think people tend to avoid certain things or topics or approaches when we communicate. And that's unconsciously most of the time, because it's just how we're wired. And I think we have a hard time with what to remember when we're communicating so that the message gets across well. And so, as a 7, I sometimes forget to remember cues or norms of mine that can make or break communication with someone else. So as a 7, I can just continue to, I have this idea in my mind, and to me, it's so crystal clear, but I tend to lead with a lot of enthusiasm and excitement, and I am a visionary. And so 7s tend to see in the future. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I'm talking to someone like you, who's a 9, and I'm casting my vision, I have to remember that you see things, you receive communication that requires me to provide you with some understanding of where we've been, because 9s see the world in a bit of a past tense nature. Mm-hmm. And if I don't know that about you, if I don't say, we're going here because we've been, we want a different outcome than where we've been, that's so helpful for me to do that for you.
Yes.
Or take, for instance, if you're communicating with an 8 or a 1, they require context. So I may be casting a vision as a 7, and that could be for dinner or in a 5-year plan. It doesn't matter.
Thing. Yeah.
I need to provide some context for those particular individuals so that they have a deeper understanding with the why. And so those are just some easy examples. And I think people too, we tend to wish that others when they speak, to understand them better so that the message comes across more clearly and fruitfully. We want to be understood.
Right.
And if you want someone to hear you in the most effective way, then you have to think about your delivery, and you have to think about your audience and what your tendencies may be when they're in an optimum state and when you're totally missing the mark. So I think that's why it's important to really focus on these things as we prepare to communicate in any situation.
Got it. So in general, our Enneagram types aside, no matter who you are or what Enneagram type you are, the point is that we want to be heard. We want to be able to deliver, and we want to be heard and have the other person reciprocate based on how we like to learn. It's just going to make for more improved communication. That's what you're trying to say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And okay. I think that it starts with us.
Yeah.
Knowing when, again, our communication style, and there's more to our communication style than just the Enneagram numbers.
Totally.
It just happens to be in our, a very incredible resource to start with, but there's a lot that plays into our personality beyond our desires and hopes, which is really what, the basis of the Enneagram is. But for us in our organization, and I know for you and I in our personal lives and our listeners who've been along with us for this 45 episode journey, that the Enneagram is probably the most powerful when it comes to understanding how someone is just naturally wired, and that it goes for, the positives and the the other sides of it as well. The things that they tend to, they're blind spots.
Shadows.
They're shadows, right?
Yeah.
We have a whole episode on that, by the way. It was very helpful. So
it was. All right. I know you have a lot of yummy stuff to share. So tell us how you're going to present it to us. Just give us a heads up so that we can
follow along. So we're going to walk through each Enneagram type. And again, I'm being a bit repetitive here for some of our listeners, but when we talk about the Enneagram, we start, and you have to, if you're new, the image is, think of it as a clock. The 9's at the top. The 9 is where the 12 is. And that's how we talk about the Enneagram, 9 all the way through 8. And so what we're going to do on this particular episode is we're going to share how each type what they tend to avoid when they're communicating, because I think that's the most important thing for us to take away when we're learning to communicate more effectively is really, well, what are we avoiding when we are attempting to connect, or when someone's attempting to connect with us. Right. So avoidance, we're going to talk about avoidance. We're going to talking about things that we need to remember to put ourselves in a position to effectively communicate with others, and also talk about, relative to each number, what others should know about each type. So again, I'm making a huge assumption here that the people listening to this podcast not only care about how they're showing up, but how they can show up better for others. And so we need to know in that instance how other numbers, what we need to know about them so that we can effectively communicate with them. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Awesome. I can't wait. Let's dive in.
All right. Well, you always love this order because we start with the 9. So please chime in. But so again, what 9s tend to avoid when they're communicating is feelings of anger,
check,
discontent or negativity, where they stand on things or their opinion. So they'll avoid that like the plague, and anything that might lead to conflict. And so I'm assuming you find all this to be true.
I do. And this is the differentiator for me. And I think a lot of 9s tie with 2 because they are very similar. And you'll see that as we talk about some of the tendencies of avoidance for the 2s. But yes, I 100% agree with all this.
Right. And so what 9s need to remember is that in order to combat what you avoid or what you may struggle with, you need to be proactive and clear in stating your opinions. Recognize and manage their expectations, and their views aren't important or won't be heard or considered.
That's what
so 9s, by the way. You really need to value your opinion and your views and express them. And obviously we have an episode 44. We talk a lot about being open-minded. Well, I think open-minded in this instance for 9s goes both ways. You need to be open-minded, more importantly in this instance, about your own views, certainly about others, but you need to be open-minded enough to share your thoughts and your opinions. And 9s tend to struggle with that somewhat. And also 9s need to remember to observe stubbornness and passive resistance that may occur when others tell them what to do.
Ruh-roh.
It's just so interesting with the 9s in my life. You will avoid conflict, but still there's this
stubbornness,
resistance. Yeah, there's this stubbornness. And I mean, I've learned this about you, and you won't say no. You don't say no to me very often, but I'll ask you to do something, or I'll make a suggestion, and then I'll circle back with you and go, where are we on that? And you're like, yeah, well, I didn't do that. And it's like, oh, okay. And so it's just interesting. I don't even know what that is
either. Like, I don't know what that is. It's just validating that you're saying it, because it's like, oh, but as long as I'm in awareness of it, that's where yes and comes into play.
What you're not doing is you're not giving me your opinion or your viewpoint that you think that request of mine was useless.
Just not good.
Was not necessary. Right. And I think the alternative to that is to go, okay, I'm going to think about that, and I'm going to circle back. And you and I've learned this through the years of working with one another in our moments of growth and in our moments of success. And it's just interesting. So if I know now, if I need something or ask something, I'll follow it up with, does that sound good to you? And sometimes I have to pry it out of you, but It's just, again, so interesting.
Which is perfect advice for the next thing that you're about to say. Probing.
Yeah, because what others need to know about nines is that nines may not tell you all of what they're thinking, which we just described.
Right.
And honestly may not know what they want when communicating. And we've talked about this a lot.
That.
Sometimes you have to give nines time to process things. And that's what I've learned. You need time to process things. And so what you don't want when you're interacting with a nine is what you don't want to do is to expect every single time an immediate answer for them to be able to fly on their feet. Sevens can fly on their feet. Threes can fly on their feet. That's not where a nine feels comfortable. Can you do it? Of course. You have to do it in leadership. I know that. And you have to do it as a parent. But is that where you're most comfortable? No. And so we should know that. So for those of us who have nines in their lives and their work lives, this is an important thing to know. Also, nines, they avoid conflict and discomfort and avoid awareness of conflictual feelings. So, that's things that we need to know about them. And also their unacknowledged anger can leak out as passive aggressive behavior.
Yep.
Yeah. It's interesting because they want what I observe is that nines want to avoid conflict, but that doesn't mean that they're in the anger triad. So that anger is just a brewing down there. And, it doesn't just come out, but boy, when it does, it's an interesting thing to witness. So we should know that just because they're not engaging, in a particular conflict doesn't mean that they're not upset about something.
Totally.
So, and that's something very critical to understand about a nine.
I just want to say something really fast before you move on, because this happened earlier today that you're completely unaware of. But anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but I was in someone's office here and I was lashing out, not at that person, but at the situation.
Sure.
And she looks at me. She's sitting in a chair and I'm standing up with my hands on her desk, like just try to picture this. And here I am, just the nine, that happy-go-lucky nine, and she's seeing and observing that I'm upset. And she goes, Megan, you have now moved into your 8 wing. Like in that moment, she called it. She was like, you have now moved into your 8 wing. And I go, I know it, damn it.
Yeah, I know it.
Fully aware. But she saw that and she knew that I wasn't upset with her. She knew I was upset with the situation, and she knew I've had enough. And so now she needs to step in and kind of help me navigate next steps. Anyway, that just happened. It's fresh off today. So I wanted to be sure I mentioned that.
Well, I think that describes a lot of different things. What it describes is a lot of self-awareness on both of your parts and trust.
Yes.
I mean, you clearly have earned trust with this individual and vice versa.
Yes.
But normally you would keep that in.
I would.
Until you couldn't anymore.
That's right.
And so it's good to me. That doesn't bother me that you were feeling anxious about a circumstance, a person that's completely different, but a circumstance. And I'm quite certain I could probably figure out what was upsetting you.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's interesting that's how far we've come as a working group. And I'm very proud of that she felt comfortable to not call you out, but to help you see. And you knew it.
It did.
But that she could observe it and allow you to just be in that 8 wing. Because quite honestly, I'm guessing what this is. There's probably 2 or 3 things.
Yeah,
I want you in the 8 wing dealing with that. Let me tell you right now, because we can't avoid the conflict.
Right.
There is a conflicting something we have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we kind of need you there. Mm-hmm. But being aware of that is, again, the biggest part of the journey. So kudos to both of you. Okay. So moving on to type 1. Type 1s tend to avoid expressing how they feel. And they, especially, relative to communication, because that's what we're talking about here today, they avoid anything that feels inappropriate to share with others.
It's so big. That is so interesting to me.
And very withdrawn.
Yes.
Can be very withdrawn. And they want to avoid mistakes that they have made or that they could potentially be blamed for.
Yes.
And I know the ones that are close to us in our lives they're going to be nodding their heads when they're listening to this episode and in full agreement, because they've they're so open about these particular struggles. And I know this as well, because as a 7, I go to 1 in stress. So all of this makes complete sense to me as well. What ones need to remember is that, or what ones need to remember about themselves is that other may perceive their intent to provide helpful feedback and improvements as negative criticisms. So
they are trying to be helpful, and I receive it as criticism.
Oh yeah. And this is something I definitely had to learn with all of you, because one of the reasons why I got the 26% approval rating is because when I would share feedback, it was being the way I was delivering it. I was being critical.
Yeah.
Completely critical. And I had to also learn it with my teenage daughter. And, I think learning that about myself helped shape our relationship, and certainly has helped me become a better leader in the company. And then ones also need to remember, if they can be more aware of their anger and process it before they communicate, it will not come out in the form of resentment or irritation. And so again, ones can be very quick, if they're not in consciousness, to be
visibly irritated.
Visibly, like not even try to hide it. Not in the least bit. There could be eye rolls. There could be body language. There could be literally, what the hell are you talking about? Like, that's what it could come out as. And once people tend to be more open to their feedback if they say what's working well in addition to what should be improved. So ones need to understand they can lead with a positive, even when they're potentially needing to talk about something that needs to be improved or changed. So it's just these little nuances of, okay, naturally, when I'm questioning something or wanting something to change, I can kind of just go right there. But others, in order to hear me, may need a little bit more of a softer opening. That's the way I think about it. I think a softer, ones have to think about a softer opening versus just getting to the black and white, the point. And so I definitely, as it relates to leadership, I think that's critical. And what we need to know, others, what we need to know about ones is that we need to be direct, concise, and logical. And, no one on this earth has taught me more about that than Marcy Allen, our quintessential one.
Sure.
And, she's taught me when she and I, and we've talked very openly about this in a number of episodes, she and I, and where we would butt heads. And because I don't always talk, I can kind of be in this gray, almost creative.
It's the fun zone. Yeah.
Yeah. Fun zone. And she's like, that makes no sense. And what she means by that, I'm missing practicality. I'm missing context, and it's not logical for her. Like, why would we do that? If you say we want to accomplish this, then where does that idea of yours fit into this equation? And so she's really helped me as a one, and even Jordan, who produces this podcast. There's many times where she's learned to, or I've learned to engage with her. I mean, I can give examples both ways, but I know I have to give a why. I have to provide some direction when I'm communicating with her in order for her to receive what I have to say. And so that's very important for us. Along those lines, when we're communicating with ones, we need to provide evidence to back up our perspective on things on the right way to do things.
Like, why do you think
they care about our perspective? Yeah. And so where they can get frustrated is when we don't lead with it.
Right.
And we need to remember that ones are already criticizing themselves internally. So they may be sensitive to anything that sounds like criticism. And that's what's so unique about ones, is that ones have to be careful about criticism. And the main reason is because they're already criticizing themselves.
Right.
Internally. It's interesting. And then, we need to try to use humor and lightness.
Which is so funny.
I know.
And it's true.
It's true. It's absolutely
so
true.
They're so intense.
So really, intense.
If
so
you can lead with humor, it's going to win. Yeah. They're going to win them over.
Absolutely. So moving on to our beloved type 2s. We have so many amazing type 2s in our world. What they tend to avoid is their own needs and feelings. And so that is a quintessential description of a 2 relative to all kinds of things, but certainly as it relates to communication. 2s tend to avoid how much they fear rejection and disapproval. And that can come out in so many different forms and formats for twos. And, but that's something that they really try to avoid. And they also try to avoid mistakes that they've made, and anything that I got off of our table there. They tend to avoid sometimes being critical and judgmental of others. Mm-hmm. So whereas a 1 can naturally go there, a 2 will avoid that.
Yep.
If they're going to make anyone feel uncomfortable, they will avoid that. And often that comes in forms of being critical or judgmental. So 2s need to be careful there. What 2s need to remember is to balance attention to others' needs when expressing their own needs directly. So they can tend to only focus on other people's needs and not say what they need in a particular situation. And while their tendency is to be open, friendly, and supportive, 2s need to create boundaries and learn to say no.
That's right.
And we know this to be true because we have 2s in our lives that we work with and personally, and we have to help them with this. This is something that 2s really struggle with. And so they need to be aware of it. And then clarity, 2s need to work on clarity about their expectations and preferences of how they would like things to happen. Mm-hmm. Just say it. Mm-hmm. Be able to articulate what you want the outcomes to be. Mm-hmm. And so when 2s are effective communicators, they're painting a picture of an outcome for you that is inclusive of what benefits you, but then also themselves. Mm-hmm. So that's the way I understand the 2s to be in their optimum state when they're communicating. And then what we need to know as we communicate with 2s is we need to ask them what they need and how they're feeling. Mm-hmm. We have to ask. Now, some that are in further along in their journey in health, they're able to articulate what they need. And so some, though, however, it depends on the circumstance, too, what it is that they're trying to communicate. So we need to know that. We also know they may need time to sort out what they need and want.
Yeah,
so they may not know. They need to maybe percolate on it a little bit, kind of like the 9s. And this is where the similarities between the 2 numbers come in.
They do. And as a leader, I recommend, sorry, Janelle, but I recommend this is something that I work on a lot. Not just 2s, but people who need time to process, is aware who are those people on your team, and just be ready for that. Ask them what they need, and then give them a couple days to come back to you with the list. I mean, you may get 1 thing or you may get 5 things, but they will give it to you. You just have to give them time to do it.
Exactly.
So that one to me is very important, especially for the 2s.
I agree. And we also need to remember to offer as much when we're communicating with 2s, is to offer as much affirmation and positive feedback as we authentically can. So I think that's very important with the 2s. All right, moving on to type 3s. Okay, what they tend to avoid when communicating is how they're actually feeling, and they struggle with talking about their emotions. So, and anything that's smells or even slightly looks like failure, they will avoid it.
That's right.
They're called the achiever for the reason. So,
and that's an accountability issue, right? So anything,
it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Like I'm going to avoid saying that. I'm going to avoid admitting that I made that mistake because it makes me look like a failure. Right.
Versus, leaning into, wait a minute, I'm going to accept that.
Right.
And it's okay. It's okay that maybe I didn't get that exactly right. But 3s, again, will just tend to avoid that part of communication altogether. They also will avoid what they might think will make them look bad or go against their constant pursuit of having a good image. So 3s really, they're very concerned about their image, and that can be healthy in some ways and then unhealthy in others. But as it relates to communication, if they think that something isn't going to make them look good, they'll avoid it. And the things that 3s really need to think about as they are working on their communication is to actually listen and ask more questions, and don't just focus on their progress towards goals.
Yeah, that's the steamroll.
Absolutely. And they need to slow down, connect, and collaborate more with others. Also, they need to work on accessing their real feelings and speak authentically about what really matters to them instead of what they think you want to hear. Because a 3 can often be in just constant performance mode.
Totally.
Because they're wired to win.
It feels good. Two.
Yeah, feels good. Absolutely. So the things that we need to remember as we interact with threes is to align results to create smoother communication. So we need to use results, whether we're forming them or actually using them as examples when we're communicating, because threes are highly focused on results and goals. So if you're communicating and you can say, let's measure the success of this in this way, or here's some facts and results that have already happened that can help shape where we need to go next. Like that would be a very loose example of how to communicate with a three. Also, we need to remember they have a hard time listening. And that doesn't mean they don't care. It just may mean that they're preoccupied with the next task because they are in constant go, get her done mode.
And you can see
so we need to remember that.
You can see it when you're speaking to a three and you're sort of belaboring a topic or you're really drilling in deep. They're just shaking their head kind of fast. Like, yes, got it. Do you have it? Because I know you need to go get back to your list. Right.
Exactly. And along those same lines, what we need to remember about a three, and you basically just said this, is that they may have a hard time slowing down and hearing more of the emotional part of the communication. Yeah. So they really are about what needs to be done. And some of the ways that we need to help them is really making sure they understand the why and the how.
Totally.
So that's critical for threes. So moving on to type 4, what they tend to avoid is the fear that people won't understand them. And we know that 4s most typically have been defined by many of the resources on the Enneagram out there as the most misunderstood number, which totally makes sense. They tend to avoid how much they tend to doubt and devalue themselves. So that's interesting. And then they avoid all of the complex emotions that they tend to feel inside. So again, the 4 is definitely high on the emotional scale as it relates to the Enneagram types. What they need to remember is not everyone is connected to or comfortable with or accepting of emotions as they are.
That's right.
Yeah, this is where 4s and 8s can really have a problem. So it's so interesting. Whereas a 4 might read The Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown and find that to be the most fascinating book ever written, whereas an 8 may take them 2 years to get through it. Right. So it's fun. While they also need to remember, while it's important that to them that others understand them, they also need to make a conscious effort to communicate well to be fully understood. So not only just sitting with the feelings, but communicating why those feelings exist and what it actually means and describing it to those of us who may not be as connected to that emotion. And being okay with that, being, again, referencing our previous episode 44, being more open-minded to those who may not be so connected to emotions. And they tend to focus more on their inner experience than what is actually happening outside of themselves. 4s live in their minds and their hearts. So we have to, they need to remember that. And we also need to remember that as communicating with them. And what we need to know about 4s, and this has been very helpful for me. I'm working with someone here now who's helping me on a couple of projects outside of DMA. And she's a 4 on the Enneagram. And so I'm learning a lot about 4s. This has been a great exercise. And so what we need to remember is it's very important to understand, to check in with them and see if they feel understood. And this is already happening a couple of weeks into our relationship. I'm seeing the importance. It's like, I trust that things are getting done and things are moving forward. But what I was really understanding early on is that the check-in is very important. So in terms of our communication, and we need to remember that they're emotionally sensitive, which can be a positive or a negative. And so we need to pay attention to that. And then they value authenticity and tell the truth. Sometimes the hard truth is where they're the most comfortable, which is an interesting dynamic. And they value authenticity. So being authentic with 4s are very important.
Yes. They can.
All right. Moving on to our 5s. What they love to avoid altogether are emotions, which is interesting because if you think of a 5, you have a 4 wing and you have a 6 wing. And so it's just 5s are considered also one of the most complex numbers to understand. And there's a very few 5s out there. If you look at the overall numbers of Enneagram types. So they tend to avoid personal information about themselves, and they tend to avoid thinking before they're ready to share. Like they don't necessarily come forth with their much about themselves, which I just stated, but then also what's on their mind. They tend to withhold that. Right. And a lot of that comes from their desire to be like accurate.
Right.
So they're not to necessarily be better than you in that way, but almost just accuracy drives them. So if they will avoid communicating if they don't feel like they have all their facts or the information that they need. And so what fives need to remember is when they don't say or share what they're thinking, people may interpret that as aloofness or insensitivity. So the fives, you need to remember when you don't communicate what you're thinking or feeling, you can seem disengaged or uninterested. So be careful there. And that the discomfort with emotions can lead to misunderstanding, interpersonal distance, and lack of trust in their working relationships, or quite frankly, any of their relationships. So that's kind of stating the same thing twice. And fives have a bigger need for privacy than most people. So it may not occur to you that it may not occur to fives to share their thoughts or feelings because privacy is just something that is innate to them. So being careful there, because sometimes communication requires you to open up if you want to be trusted and heard. And then fives need to remember that to help in the dynamics of teams or groups, or quite frankly, your personal relationships, that when you share information, people are going to trust you more and open themselves up to you more. So that's something very important to remember. Also, what we need to remember as we interact with fives is they are much more sensitive than they appear. So just because they may not be sharing, or just because they may seem to be withholding, that doesn't mean that they don't have sensitivities. They absolutely do. And we need to remember that while experiencing emotions, they prefer to process them alone. So allowing them to sit with something for a while is very important. And then I think it's important, if we're trying to engage with a five, is to follow up with them, but certainly to encourage them to follow up with you once they've had time to process whatever it is that you've been communicating. And just because they aren't communicating much doesn't mean that they aren't fully connected or engaging. They just tend to, they're thinking. They're thinking before they're speaking, which is quite frankly the opposite of a seven, which is interesting because sevens go to five in growth. And so these things speak to me as well, is because I need to sometimes learn to process things before I just react.
Right.
So there's so many times where you point out to me, working with me, Danelle, this is a time for you to go to your five. Like, we need you to sit in your five for a minute and really process and think through this. And so all this, of course, speaks to me.
I just realized that my grandfather, I can't believe it. Like all these years we've been studying the Enneagram. And I just wanted to point this out because this may be a helpful tip for people who are trying to identify which we don't necessarily encourage, but you can kind of tell what people are. My grandfather has passed, but listening to you talk about all these things, he was the kind of person that would sit in a room. I mean, and I'm talking to like, I had 100 family members in a room at once, maybe. It was a large Catholic family. He may not say a word, but when he spoke, everyone listened. You know what I'm talking? So you may not hear from this man for hours. He's sitting there and he's taking it all in. And then when he spoke, it was like silence, because everyone couldn't wait to hear the wisdom that was about to come out of his mouth. So it just occurred to me that he was probably a five before. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Might have been a five. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right. Moving on to type 6. So sixes tend to avoid, positive and problem-free view of what's happening. So they'll avoid it. They're going to go worst case scenario every single time, typically. And they also avoid their fears and anxieties or suspicions. Mm-hmm. So, and then when they're really thinking before they fully trust the person they're communicating with, they can, again, distance themselves or avoid that when they're not in full trust of someone. That's so it takes a while to earn trust from a 6. And I think you certainly know this to be true. You're married to one, and we have sixes in our organization. Earning trust with the six is very important and something to remember. And especially as it relates to communication, because what you're saying to them, they're going to doubt it. And they're not going to doubt it because they doubt you. So keep that in mind. It's just the circumstance or what's being said. They tend to think about it through a completely different lens at times than some of the other numbers. And so that's just an important thing to remember about a six, meaning also, and we've mentioned this, that they require context. And so keep that in mind. What sixes need to remember is you need to remember that you pay a disproportionate amount of attention to problems and threats versus what good could come.
That's right.
And, and we've talked a lot about that on previous episodes. And so also sixes need to understand that they may interpret their communication as negative, or others may interpret their communication as negative or pessimistic. So being aware of that, sixes, is very important, because you may just be thinking about all things that maybe haven't been thought about, but it comes across as, geez, give
me a break, man. Yeah, I say that a lot.
Give me a break. Exactly. And, it's also important for six to remember that highlighting what's working and opportunities for potential solutions is just as important as highlighting the opportunities for problems. So a mixture of both is very helpful when you're communicating, certainly in the workplace, but I know also personally that's important. So what we need to know when we're communicating with sixes is that they over-index toward problems, risk, and threat. They're just wired that way. So if you're communicating with, state the obvious of, here's what I think needs to happen. Here's what I know is going to be, the easy part, or what I believe is the great outcome. And here's where I think we might just have some struggles.
Right.
And when you're able to do that, first of all, you're forming trust because they've already gone there.
Yeah.
So you're meeting them where they are, you're winning with a six. So that's critically important. And they are wonderful team players. We need to know that. You want sixes on your team because what they inherently possess is discernment. You, especially a seven, those of us, they help us understand what we may not even be able to see because we're just so excited to get to the next thing or, accomplish the thing. It's threes. I'm thinking of threes and sixes. They're, interesting dynamic there. Yep. So, and then what we need to understand is it does take them a while to develop trust. And so when you know that, you can consciously work on building that trust with a six because they need it. And a way to do that is to be consistent and forthcoming with them about
whatever
what you're thinking, whatever it may be, and just saying, hey, I need you to know this. May not have the full answer, but I need you to know this about this particular circumstance. Is very helpful when you're communicating with a six. And this is kind of a restating what we've already said, but they tend to poke holes in plans and projects as a way to ensure success. So when a six is saying, well, what if this happens or what if that happens? We need to understand that that doesn't mean they don't want the project or whatever it is to go forward. It just may mean they want to ensure success. So we need to have our mindsets in the right way when we're thinking about communicating with sixes.
Thank you for that. That was a really helpful one for someone who's married to a six, that they're trying to ensure success versus poke holes because,
Yeah, for the sake of
doing it.
They're not necessarily always being argumentative.
That's right. There you go.
Or the downers.
Love it.
And you need to understand as a 9, certainly, but for a 7 with a strong 6 wing at times, especially as an owner of a business, but when I'm the alternative, when I'm in let's have fun mode, sometimes 6s, you're like, wow, I didn't think about I don't want to think about that happening.
Yeah.
So, it's like, boo on that. All right. Moving on to 7s. And I'll probably speak in the, first person, because this is, as you all definitely probably know by now, I'm a 7. So what we tend to avoid is, which is interesting, negative data or the downside or what's not working. Completely just avoid it. Nope. See everything through rose-colored glasses. That's the color of glasses we wear. We tend to avoid painful and uncomfortable feelings. And we tend to, is all forms of communication, whether it's personal or professional. And then we tend to avoid fears or anxiety or discomfort. And we don't necessarily want to engage in discussions where any of that is coming. So we do almost better when we don't know it's coming, but I can tell you, just if I know that there's something a conversation coming that's going to require discomfort, I have to work really hard to put myself into a winning mindset, because I would rather just
not have it,
let you deal with it, or someone else, or just literally not talk about it at all, which is not the right thing to do. So what we need to understand is that, an exclusive focus on what's positive may engender mistrust or contribute problems with others. And so, because we can come off as almost being unrealistic and unbelievable at times with our ideas or with what we're trying to communicate. So sometimes inauthenticity can come through when we don't want it to, because we're focused too much on this beautiful outcome of whatever it may be that we're communicating about. And then others may perceive our enthusiasm and optimism, as I was saying, as naive and superficial. Like, Danelle, have you even thought about that? And yeah, I've thought a lot about it. Well, you missed a few things. You missed a few details. That doesn't, and again, most of the time, I thought about it. I just didn't communicate well about it. So sevens, we need to be really conscious of that.
That's good.
And sometimes it's necessary to have a difficult conversation about what's not working to achieve a positive outcome. And so part of the self-smarter journey, and a big genesis for this podcast, is for me in my relationship to it is learning how to have those types of conversation and being okay with it. And so I think for sevens, we have to be okay with those conversations. And again, I think the best way that you get better at that is to practice it. And so be conscious of when it's an opportunity. Things that others need to know about sevens is that even though we don't show it, we are sensitive to criticism and not being taken seriously. So that's something for those of you who are engaging with sevens to know. And that, sevens fear getting stuck in or trapped in negative emotions. So being stuck is not a good thing for a seven. So when you're thinking about communicating with that, options are really good. I can just tell you, options are really good for a seven. And being able to describe a yes, being able to understand that, and you, Megan, have learned to do this with me, is I hate to say no to anything. I mean, now I'm talking specifically about requests, or exceptions or whatever it may be. Saying no is not fun. Giving us options relative to ways to say yes, or not now, but maybe, or whatever it may be, is very important. And an important thing to learn about a seven is that they may not realize that their focus on fun and pleasure constitutes avoidance of painful feelings. So what's important here, I think, is to ask questions. What are you worried about? Because I can guarantee you sevens typically aren't going to throw that out there.
No.
They're not going to talk about what they're worried about or what might cause them concern. They're not going to lead with that. So it's important when you're communicating with a seven is to ask those questions and to be curious about what they may be bothered by, because again, they're going to avoid it like the plague. So, all right, moving on. It's our last number, 8. And so what they tend to avoid is any kind of weakness or any actions or communication that could be perceived as weakness. So weakness is a no-go for the 8s. They also tend to avoid vulnerable feelings like hurt, sadness, fear, and pain. Again, 8s may take 2 years to read Atlas of the Heart if they even make it past the first couple of chapters. Right. They tend to avoid indecision, uncertainty, and lack of commitment to taking action. So they can kind of sit in this whirlwind of when they're stuck. They can get stuck fairly easily relative to, especially around communications. So they need to be aware of that. Things that 8s need to remember about themselves is that and gosh, our eights are going to be shaking their heads. And I get this too, the strong 8 wing, is that other may perceive them as being intimidating. And again, that word really bothers the eights in my life and bothers me too, having an 8 wing, is especially as it pertains to women. We can tend to be seen if you have this number or if it's an active part of your Enneagram sequence, is that we can be seen as bossy, intimidating, when really it's fueled by confidence.
Yes.
And
passion.
But we can be told it's something different, and that's difficult. Eights need to remember small things like smiling more, which I don't really like that. I mean, I understand, but I don't like it, especially for women. But what I do know to be true is that we definitely need to make sure that they're not sitting there with a scowl on their face.
Yes.
And that scowl, I've had to work on it.
Yes.
For me, most of the time in the eights that I'm close to in my life, it's thinking.
Yes.
It's not, it's not a scowl like you're dumb, or I don't like what you're saying.
Yeah, with the 8s and the 1s are very similar because they wear their disdain on their sleeve.
It's not even disdain. There's their thought, their thinking process is there. So they're processing something, but it's coming off not in a good way.
Yeah.
So yes,
that's when you would have the break and I think I finally told you, I was like, are you mad? Because when I'm speaking,
yeah. No, I'm not mad. I'm just thinking about what you're saying.
I'm processing. I was like, oh, okay.
But now you can barely understand that because I've come such a long way, and Botox. Anyway, that's another. Eights need to remember that they can be more powerful when they express vulnerability as well as strength.
I'm telling you, that's the biggest thing.
The biggest thing for the eights. And I know that the eights in our lives are working on that a lot. And the biggest indicator of strength is the ability to communicate vulnerability. And I think those two go hand in hand. So expressing vulnerability in multiple ways, but then certainly through communication. And that's leading with, I didn't always get this right, or I feel this way about you. And so, I mean, there's simple ways that eights need to understand the importance of that. And so, because they tend to, again, want to be they want to shield those things. What we need to know about communicating with eights is they don't mean to be intimidating. Like we said, there could just be some deep thought there.
Right.
So again, I think if you're communicating, stop and ask, are you understanding? Am I making sense? Is this, are you relating to this? Do you have a question? So there's ways that we can lead an 8 beyond, this feeling that they may not care, or they may think, they're not trying to necessarily always be intimidating. And so, and they often, I think 8s, and I see this to be true, they often don't understand their impact.
Right.
I mean, many of our world leaders and some of the greatest leaders we have are 8s, and there's a reason for that. And they often don't know their own strength. And I mean, I can attest to this. It's amazing to me. And their passions for moving things forward, protecting others, fighting injustice, and meeting challenges express their generosity and dedication to people. So the things that 8s can almost be stereotyped as from a negative perspective, it's actually their strength when we can identify that in the 8s in our lives. And so we need to remember that there's no one you want in a foxhole more in a given situation, especially a challenging one, than an 8.
That's right.
And I can tell you that firsthand. So I think remembering that when we're communicating and helping them beyond what they may not fully grasp. And I mentioned this earlier, 8s and 1s require a lot of context. So if you're communicating and you're not providing that, you're probably going to get the look of, I'm not, whatever description you want to call it, but there's going to be a question mark on their forehead. So keeping those things in mind are really important with 8s. But that takes us through all the numbers and different ways that we can communicate more effectively. And I think it's critical to our self-smarter journey.
It is. And, you gave a lot of good context here, so I don't want to,
Sure.
We don't have to rehash all that, but I do want to know, I usually ask you this question, what do you know for sure about communication and improving it?
We're just different.
Yeah.
We're wired different.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is nurture and nature. And a lot of what we've talked about today is just really how we're wired. But in order for us to be the best version of ourselves, communication is critical. And it's the genesis of why we started this podcast, is because I was not a good communicator. And this topic, we've talked about this in a number of ways. And so this will probably continue to be something that we resurface in different ways because it's so critical. And we want to give you, our listeners, different ways to think about it, and depending on where you are in your journeys. And I think in general, I struggled with it and I got called out for it through an evaluation process, but I know that everyone struggles with it.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think that's why we continue to elevate this particular topic in different ways.
Right.
And, I think when we understand that we're all unique and different, then there's this inherent empathy and open-mindedness towards other people. And for those of you listening to this podcast, you've committed to becoming a better version of yourself as it pertains to leadership, in the workplace and in your personal lives. And a lot of what we know to be true and what we're still learning is that communication is center in effective communication. So where does effective communication come from? In our experience, it's by understanding how other people receive information and what they need in order to hear you more effectively, and then also understanding what you need to do to be more effective communicators. So
thank you.
That's what I know for sure. And I'm still learning every day.
We are still learning. And it's just nice to have this community where we can talk about these things. And, I get on the phone a lot, or Zoom or Teams lately, especially talking to people, men and women in our industry, who are listening, and they bring up topics that we have. And just for me, that's an improvement of communication. They're giving me a signal that they're listening. They're listening to what we have to say and you just using it in their lives. So, to Danelle's earlier point, with this being our last podcast of 2022, just thank you for doing that. You're helping us by communicating with us, and telling us what you're gravitating towards or what you're struggling with is helping us become
Absolutely.
Produce content that's going to serve you better. And that's the goal.
Absolutely. So I cannot believe this is the last episode, and I can't echo enough of the gratitude that we feel for the continuous support and feedback for this little project that we didn't even know if it was going to fly. And again, can't thank our team who brings this to life each and every week. And certainly that's with the Snacks Media crew led by David, and certainly Jordan and Jesse. And there's many others on the DMA team that work to make sure that this podcast is done in a way that is helping people. And to echo Meg's comment, I think the greatest thing that keeps us going is when we get the notes, just the text or the emails, or special, when we see someone and there's a comment about the podcast. I know Meg was recently at an event and couldn't walk 2 feet. People stopping her to talk about the podcast, and it was men and women. And that just feels so great. So we know we've struck a nerve relative or uncovered an area of leadership and discussion that maybe not found exactly in a book or in a certain scenario, because this podcast is all based off of what we've experienced. Mm-hmm. So just again, we'll probably skip our music moment today, because we definitely want to make sure that we are expressing our gratitude. And we so look forward to kicking off 2023. Wow. The new year with a lot of new content, exciting guests lined up. So again, from the bottom of our hearts, we're so grateful to each and every one of you, and hope you have a wonderful, healthy holiday season.
Happy holidays. We send you into the week with grateful hearts, guys.
As always, you can connect with us on Instagram and Facebook at Self Smarter Podcasts. You can also leave a rating or review if you enjoyed what you heard today. Not only does this mean so much to us, but it also helps other leaders and future leaders find our community. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us in becoming self-smarter. This podcast is produced by Snacks Media, and music is from a free platform. Well, that is until Brandy Carlisle reaches out to us to write the original score for our podcast. Friends, have a great rest of your day.